Oliver Blackwood had always been fascinated by horror stories. He wrote horror novels that often became bestsellers, and he traveled to supposedly haunted places to gain inspiration for his books. But he had never believed in paranormal phenomena. To him, it was all just stories that people made up to scare themselves. However, this was about to change. One day, Oliver received a letter from a fan who lived near an old lighthouse. The letter spoke of the lighthouse's dark history and how the last lighthouse keepers had vanished without a trace. The locals reported otherworldly events happening to whoever stayed at the lighthouse. Oliver saw this as an opportunity to gain inspiration for his next book, so he decided to visit the lighthouse. When he arrived, he stared in awe of the scenery. The lighthouse stood tall and imposing, its dark white walls contrasting sharply with the dark, stormy sky above. Its sturdy cylindrical tower rose up from a solid base, tapering towards the top where the lighthouse's beacon was housed. The beacon emitted a strong, steady light that cut through the darkness, warning ships of the treacherous rocks that lurked beneath the waves. The lighthouse was surrounded by jagged rocks that jutted out of the churning sea, creating a perilous obstacle course for any vessel that dared to venture too close. The waves crashed against the rocks, sending spray flying up into the air and making the whole area seem even more ominous. Despite the lighthouse's important function, it had an eerie feel to it. He was greeted by the current lighthouse keeper, an elderly man named George. Oliver noticed that George seemed nervous and twitchy. George showed Oliver around the lighthouse and explained its history. Oliver was intrigued, but still didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. As the night drew in, Oliver settled down in his room. He couldn't sleep, so he decided to go and talk to George. George told Oliver about the night the last lighthouse keepers vanished. He said that they had been acting strangely for a few days before they disappeared. They would often stare out into the ocean for hours, even though there were no ships around. And they would talk to themselves in hushed tones, as if they were talking to someone who wasn't there. The night they vanished, there was a terrible storm, and the lighthouse beacon went out. When the storm passed, the lighthouse keepers were nowhere to be found. Oliver listened to George's story with interest, but at the same time with disbelief. As they were talking, Oliver noticed that George was staring out into the ocean. He asked George what he was looking at, but George didn't answer. He just continued to stare out into the darkness. Suddenly, there was a loud banging noise. It sounded like someone was trying to break down the door. George rushed to the door and tried to hold it shut, but the force behind the banging was too strong. The door burst open, and a rush of cold air swept into the room. Oliver and George were both thrown to the floor. When they looked up, they saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, but he looked non-human. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. He beckoned to them, and they both stood up and followed him out into the storm. Outside, the wind was howling, and the rain was coming down in sheets. The man led them to the edge of the cliff, where they saw a portal open up in the sky. Through the portal, they could see a world that was not their own. A world of darkness and despair where unspeakable horrors lurked in the shadows. Oliver and George were frozen with fear. They wanted to run, but they couldn't move. The man stepped through the portal, and they followed him. As they entered the other world, they felt a sensation that was both terrifying and exhilarating. They saw things that they couldn't describe, things that defied all logic and reason. They saw creatures that were half human, half monsters. They saw landscapes that were both beautiful and horrifying. They wandered through the other world for what seemed like hours, until they came to a massive castle. The castle was a dark and foreboding structure that rose high above them. Its walls were made of stone, and its towers reached up to the sky like skeletal fingers. The castle was surrounded by a moat filled with murky water, and a drawbridge that looked as though it hadn't been lowered in centuries. As they crossed the drawbridge, Oliver and George could hear the sound of creatures stirring within the castle walls. The castle itself was in a state of disrepair, with cracks running through the stone walls and alien red weeds growing through the cracks. The air was thick with a musty smell, as though the castle had been abandoned for millennia. They stepped inside the castle, and they were hit by a wave of otherworldly energy that made their skin crawl. The walls were made of black, obsidian-like material that seemed to shift and writhe like a living thing. The air was thick with a pungent, acrid smell that made their eyes water. As they made their way deeper into the castle, they came across a throne room. The room was large and cavernous, with high ceiling and walls lined with tapestries depicting gruesome scenes of torture and death. The creatures that filled the room looked like they had stepped straight out of a nightmare, with twisted limbs, tentacles, and eyes that glowed a pale green color. The being on the throne, though, was the most terrifying of them all. A gigantic creature, a humanoid monster with tentacles and teeth. Its form seemed to shift and change with every passing moment, and its eyes burned like embers. Oliver and George stood before the being. They felt as if they were tiny insects being scrutinized by a giant, malevolent god. They knew deep down that they were not in control, and that they were at the mercy of forces they could not comprehend. It spoke to them in a language they didn't understand, but somehow they could still comprehend its meaning. The being told them that they had been chosen, that they had been brought to this world for a purpose. They were to be eternal keepers of the Lighthouse, and they would be responsible for keeping the portal between their world and the other world open. They would be the guardians of a gateway that would allow unspeakable horrors to enter their world. Oliver and George were horrified by what they had heard. They begged to be sent back home, but the being just laughed. It told them that they had no choice, that they had already been marked by the other world. They could never go back to their old lives. Oliver and George were in shock. They refused to accept the responsibility for being the guardians of the gateway between the worlds. They didn't want to be responsible for unleashing terror and destruction upon their own world. They decided to try and escape. They ran through the castle, dodging creatures that seemed to be hunting them. They found a door that led to a long, triangular, dark tunnel. They ran through the tunnel, hoping to find a way out, but they were not alone. The creatures were after them. They could hear their footsteps echoing through the tunnel. They could hear their howls and growls getting louder and louder. Oliver and George were running out of breath. They had been running for what seemed like hours, when the howls and growls of the creatures suddenly stopped, and they were enveloped by silence. They thought they were safe at last. They stopped running and tried to catch their breath. Just as they were about to discuss what their next move would be in order to escape this nightmarish dimension, a deafening rumble sounded, and gargantuan creatures of unimaginable horror appeared from everywhere. They had nowhere to run. The creatures moved in, ready to capture them. Oliver and George closed their eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But then something strange happened. Oliver felt a sudden jolt, and everything went black. When he opened his eyes again, he was lying in his bed back at home. He sat up, gasping for air. He looked around the room, trying to make sense of what had happened. He thought it was all just a dream, a product of his overactive imagination. He grabbed the letter the fan sent him about the lighthouse from his nightstand and started reading it again. But then, from the same envelope, a photograph fell on the floor that he didn't see before. He picked it up and looked at it closely. At the bottom of the photograph was a small note that read, "The two missing lighthouse keepers." His heart skipped a bit when he saw the faces of the keepers. One of them was George, the same George he had met at the lighthouse in his dream. Oliver was in shock. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Was it all real? He now had the story for his book, but he was more skeptical than ever. He wondered if there were other gateways, other creatures, other worlds. Oliver knew one thing for sure. He would never forget what he had experienced. He would never forget the terror and at the same time the amazement of being in the other world. And he would always wonder what other mysteries lay hidden in the darkness, waiting to be uncovered.